Auspicious greeting. Welcome back to the core teaching class. Last time, I talked about how, in a sense, we're sort of like living in this virtual reality system. I would like to ask you to imagine the scenario. So now you can sort of close your eyes and imagine the scenario. Imagine that you're living in this virtual realities. You have an infinite life, meaning you do not die, so you live on. However, not dying doesn't mean that you won't get sick or you won't have any dissatisfactions or sufferings. All these would still happen to you. It's just that you're not growing old and you will not die in the end. Of course, you will live on to 100 years, 1,000 years, to 1,000,000 years. So life is infinite for you. However, only you have this infinite life. Your friends, your families, they won't have. So every 50 years to 60 years, you probably have a new groups of friends, and you would see that they grow old and ultimately pass away. Then you will meet a new group of friends, and again, seeing them old and pass away. So this cycle would continue on and on. Sound very lonely, right? But then maybe you might think, uh, although there's this drawback, but I feel that it's still very good because there's a lot of advantage to it. Since I will have a lot of time to achieve many of my dreams. Even though I may fail, but then I do have the time to try them all out. But let us add one more changeable factors to this. Let's say every 100 years or so, you will need to restart all over again. So every 100 years, you will need to receive your 20 years of educations and then start to make money and accumulate all this money to buy a house and a car and continue with your life. Then after that 100 years, you would start all over again. And you will lose your possession, you will lose your wealth, your fame, your education, your relationship, and so on. You might think, well, this is also okay with me. I can try out a different career every single time. Like maybe for one life, I can be an entrepreneur. For another life, I can be maybe the president of a country. Or in another life, I can be an engineer and so on. So I can be a different person or have a different career every 100 years. I have a lot of time. It seemed to sound good. Now, let us add one more factors, which is every 100 years, you will need to draw. You will need to draw to determine your fate for that 100 years. And in the box, there might be a slip that said, oh, you'll be hungry for 100 years. Or you're so hungry that you won't be able to work. Or you can be a human and just lead an ordinary life. Or you can be someone who's poor. Or you might be someone who's suffering in jail. So there are all these different draw. But then when you think about it again, you might think, oh, it's fine because it's a gamble. So maybe I would win. I would be able to draw that lucky draw. And now let me add one last factors, which is there are only 1,000 draw that said you would suffer in jail, 100 draw that said you would be suffering in hungers, but there's only one draw that said you will lead an ordinary life. So if this is the case with such a low probabilities of being able to be a human and lead an ordinary life, in this case, do you still want to live in this virtual realities or in this system? Imagine this long, infinite life with all these changeable factors. In this case, we might probably want to break out of this virtual reality, right? So in 2,500 years ago, someone actually made the same decisions that we probably just made, like, I need to break out of this. And this person is Prince Datta, which I have talked about before, and who later became the Buddha, our teachers. He had seen the sufferings of old age, sickness, and death. Therefore, he decided to renounce and to try to find a way to end these sufferings. He renounced because he realized that these sufferings doesn't just happen in this life, but they would continue on. And the concept of rebirth in India at the time is actually quite common. And people are trapped in this cycle of rebirth, and they would have to start their life every time after they died. So this sound a bit familiar, right? It's sort of just like this virtual reality system that we talked about just now. In one of the sutras in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha said, from an inconstructible beginning comes transmigration. A beginning point is not evidence, though beings hindered by ignorance and feathered by craving are transmigrating and wandering on. Long have you thus experienced stress, experienced pain, experienced loss, swelling the cemeteries enough to become disenchanted with all fabricated things, enough to become dispassionate, enough to be released. Understanding about the sufferings from transmigration and rebirth and all these sufferings that we have in our life basically serve as a motivation for us to work through, to try to find a way to end all these sufferings. And of course, this is the same for Prince Siddhartha at the time. He want to find a way and be liberated, just like what's mentioned in the sutras. It's basically talking about how all of us or all the beings are transmigrating within this cycle of life and death. And of course, it's due to ignorance, and it's propelled by our craving. And because of that, we experience a lot of stress and pain. And because of these pain and stress and sufferings, it's enough to push us to find a way to become released, to be liberated from this cycle. And we know that Prince Siddhartha had practiced ascetic practice for 6 years, and he attained enlightenment under the Bodhi trees. What was the prince contemplating under the Bodhi trees? I'm sure all of us would be very curious, because this would definitely help us, and we will probably want to know the thought process that the Prince Siddhartha or the Buddha had before he attained enlightenment. So in the Nagara Sutras in Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha actually told us what he was contemplating under the Bodhi trees. From learning about this thought process, we should all take some time and follow this contemplation and see for ourselves. Before I begin though, I would now like to ask you to pause the video and take out a piece of paper and a pen, because there are a lot of factors in there. So as we're going through the sutras together, I would like to ask you to jot down the important factors that are in this thought process. And then afterward, it will definitely help us in learning more about each of these factors. Okay. Now let us follow the Buddha's contemplation process before he attained enlightenment. This is what the Buddha said. Monk, when I'm still an unawakened bodhisattva, a realization came to me. How this world has fallen on difficulties. It is born, it aged, it died, it falls away, and then born again. But it doesn't recognize the escape from the sufferings, from this aging and death. When will it apprehend the escape from sufferings, this aging and death. Then these thoughts came to me. Aging and death exist when what exists? What is the requisite conditions for aging and death to exist? From my appropriate attention, there came the breakthrough of discernment. Aging and death exist when birth exists. From birth as a requisite conditions come aging and death. So birth is the conditions that are required for us to grow old and die. Okay, let us continue. Then the thought occurred to me. Birth exists when what exists? From what as a requisite conditions come birth. From my appropriate attention, there came the breakthrough of discernment. Birth exists when becoming exists. From becoming as a requisite conditions comes birth. So there need to be becoming. We'll talk more about it in later today's class. That's the conditions for birth. Okay. Name and form exists when what exists. From what as a requisite conditions is there name and form? From my appropriate attention, there came the breakthrough of discernment. Name and form exist when consciousness exists. From consciousness as a requisite conditions comes name and form. Then the thought occurred to me, consciousness exists when what exists? From what as a requisite conditions comes consciousness. From appropriate attention, there came the breakthrough of discernment. Consciousness exists when name and form exist, and from name and form as a requisite conditions come consciousness. So please make sure you jot down all these different factors here, like consciousness, name and form, and so on. Okay, and let us continue. Then the thought occurred to me, this consciousness turn back at name and form and go no further. It is to this extent that there is birth, aging, death, falling away, and re-arising. For example, from name and form as a requisite conditions comes consciousness. From consciousness as a requisite conditions come names and form. From name and form as a requisite conditions comes the sixth sense media. Thus is the origination of this entire mass of stress. Origination. Vision arose, clear knowing arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose. Illumination arose within me with regard to things never heard before. Then the thought occurred to me, aging and death don't exist when what doesn't exist. From the cessation of what comes the cessation of aging and death. From my appropriate attentions, there came a breakthrough of discernment. Aging and death don't exist when birth doesn't exist. From the cessation of birth comes the cessation of aging and death. So from this part, basically the Buddha, it's going the counterclockwise directions, I would say. So now he starts to ask himself, so what conditions doesn't exist when would cause the cessation of aging and death? And of course here it mentioned that, if there is cessation of birth, then there would be cessation of aging and death. So now from this, you can sort of remember what we have talked about last class, that cycle with cause go into effects, and then effects is the cause for the next effects, right? So basically this is what it's starting to talk about. So the Buddha is right now, it's trying to contemplate in the counterclockwise directions. And so let us continue. Name and form doesn't exist when what doesn't exist. From the cessation of what come the cessation of name and form. From my appropriate attention, there came the breakthrough of discernment. Name and form doesn't exist when consciousness doesn't exist. From the cessation of consciousness comes the cessation of name and form. Then the thought occurred to me, consciousness doesn't exist when what doesn't exist. From the cessation of what comes the cessation of consciousness. From my appropriate attention, there came the breakthrough of discernment. Consciousness doesn't exist when name and form doesn't exist. From the cessation of name and form comes the cessation of consciousness. The thought occurred to me, I have attained this path to awakening. For example, from the cessation of name and form comes the cessation of consciousness. From the cessation of consciousness comes the cessation of name and form. From the cessation of name and forms comes the cessation of the sixth sense media. From the cessation of the sixth sense media comes the cessation of contact. From the cessation of contact comes the cessation of feelings. From the cessations of feelings comes the cessation of craving. From the cessation of craving comes the cessation of clinging or substance. From the cessation of clinging or substance comes the cessation of becoming. And from the cessation of becoming comes the cessation of birth. From the cessation of birth, then aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair all cease. Thus is the cessation of this entire mass of stress. Cessation, cessation. Vision arose, clear knowing arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose, illumination arose within me with regard to things never heard before. In the same way, I saw an ancient path, an ancient road, traveled by the rightly self-awakened one of former times. And what is that ancient path, that ancient road traveled by the rightly self-awakened ones of former times? Just this noble eightfold path, right view, right aspiration, right speech, right actions, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. That is the ancient path, the ancient road, traveled by the rightly self-awakened one of former times. I follow that path. Following it, I came to direct knowledge of aging and death, direct knowledge of the origination of aging and death, direct knowledge of the cessation of aging and death, direct knowledge of the path leading to the cessation of aging and death. I followed that path. Following it, I came to direct knowledge of birth, becoming, clinging, craving, feeling, contact, the sixth sense media, name and form, consciousness, direct knowledge of the origination of consciousness, direct knowledge of the cessation of consciousness, direct knowledge of the path leading to the cessation of consciousness. I follow that path. So in summary, the Buddha first contemplate upon what is the requisite conditions that leads to aging and death, and start to think of the requisite conditions that lead one factors to the next. And basically, he contemplate upon the conditions that push us on in the cycle of life and death. Then, of course, he reversed the process. If you think about it, he start to think about, okay, the cessation of what conditions lead to the cessation of the previous conditions. and which ultimately lead to the cessations of sufferings. Through this contemplation, vision and direct knowledge arose. He also realized that through following the Noble Eightfold Path, it will lead him to direct knowledge of dependent originations, to these realizations. Again, this is why we should all try to practice the Noble Eightfold Path in our life. And so I really do hope that you have taken some time to contemplate upon the Noble Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, and then how you can apply it to your life. Remember, this is the Asian path that all the past Buddha has walked on, and ultimately they all attain Buddhahood and attain enlightenment. So as long as we also practice the Noble Eightfold Path, we will also reach this realization, this attainment of enlightenment one day. So what did the Buddha realize under the Bodhi trees? The Buddha realized dependent origination of life, basically how sentient beings transmigrate in the cycle of life and death. So just a review from the last class, in case if you don't remember what dependent origination is. So dependent origination arises from the translation for the Pali's word paticca samuppada, and so it means that all phenomena arise in dependence upon other phenomena. So, and in other words, dependent originations means all phenomena arise from causes and conditions. So the causes required all the supporting conditions or the requisite conditions in order for it to become an effect. So nothing arises by themselves independently. This is also the same for how we travel from one life to another. Basically the same for our life. And of course, we call this the 12th link of dependent originations. And the 12 here refer to the 12 requisite conditions that we see in the sutra just now. So these are the 12 requisite conditions for us in this transmigration of the cycle of life and death. Once, the Buddha told us a metaphor of the 12th link of dependent origination. He said that the 12th link of dependent origination is sort of like the wall of a kingdom. So if you imagine the medieval time, like basically the kingdom is surrounded or protected by all these walls, right? And so, and with all the walls, there's not just one gate. Obviously, there would be a lot of different gateway. And so you can imagine that like the 12th link of dependent origination is like this wall with maybe 12 gates, you can say, and people are trapped within this wall. And although there are many exits, however, all these exits are guarded by soldiers, so we cannot just like head out easily. And so it's not easy for us to pass through. However, if we just break through one gate, then basically we'll be liberated, we'll be free from that place, right? So for us, although we're trapped in this cycle, so as you can see in the cycle, we're trapped in the cycle of life and death, but we could break through out of this cycle as long as we break through from any one of them. But then of course right now we cannot break through because of our greed, angers, and ignorance, self-attachment, and delusions. So because of all these factors, we cannot break through from it. However, the Buddha did tell us that there is a way to break through from the cycle. It all depends on what we do. There's a saying in Buddhism that goes like this: if you want to know what you have done in the past, look at how you are right now. And if you want to know how you would be in the future, it depends on what you do right now. And so from this, we can see that it all depends on our course of actions. Our faith lies in our hand. So this is why what we do in the past will lead us to how we are right now in this current life. Similarly, how we want our future to be, it depends on our actions right now. Therefore, there is no creator who determine our life, or there is no random selections. It all arises from causes and conditions. It all depends on our actions. And we will understand more of why this is through learning about the 12 link of dependent originations. So now let us look at what each of these conditions means. Okay. But before I explain what each of these conditions are, let me again tell you what the 12 links are so that you know. So basically, the 12 link of dependent originations are ignorance, karmic formations, or sometimes you see the word fabrication, consciousness, name and form, sixth sense organ, contact, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, and last but not least, aging and death. So these are the 12. I do hope that you can probably write that down and then make sure you understand what each of them are so that it would actually help us in next class when we talk about how we can break through from this cycle of life and death, or break through from this 12 link of dependent origination. Okay. Ignorance. So ignorance refers to the fact that we don't understand the truth of the universe. Like we don't understand the truth. But then, of course, it then begs the question of what is the truth? And I think we sort of talk about this in the first class. But just a review, truth should be something that's universal. It means that it applied to everyone, regardless of race. So it applied to African, Asian, American, and so on. So it should be the same for everyone. And of course, it applied through time. So it's the same whether it's in the past, the present, and the futures. And it applied everywhere. So regardless of where you are, whether you're in Europe, North America, or Oceania, or Africa, and so on, it's the same. And of course, it's also inevitable. So it would happen as such. So that's what a truth is. And so as we're learning the Dharma, of course, we said that the Dharma are like the truth of the universe. So you can see it for yourself and analyze it for yourself to see if it's true or not. So you can observe it for yourself. This is why the Buddha said, even if he was not born in the world, the truth would be here. The Dharma would be here. And of course, the same thing with dependent originations. So even if the Buddha was not born, you can still observe dependent originations in your life. So back to talking about ignorance. So what don't we understand? We don't understand that all phenomena arises from causes and conditions. So maybe we might think that, oh, someone just create this, but then we didn't realize that whatever that's create, or whatever that's create, it also arises from causes and conditions. And we don't understand that all phenomena are impermanence. We don't understand that all dharma are selfless, or it might be easier for you to understand it's without a self nature. And of course, we don't understand the Four Noble Truth. We might think that we know, at least I think I know, like I know about impermanence, But then at the back of our mind, we don't really, or at the subconscious level, we don't really believe it. This is why when we see changes, sudden changes, like if someone tell me, oh, a loved one just passed away, or someone that we know just have a huge accidents and pass away, it's very hard for us to accept. And that's because at the subconscious level, we didn't understand that changes are happening all the time. And ignorance is the root of why people are trapped in the cycle of life and death. And so this is why learning about the Dharma is the first step in becoming awakened, I would say. So the first step of us on this path into realizations. And ignorance is also the source for all defilement or afflictions in our life. Karmic formation. So karmic formation is sometimes called fabrication. A lot of time it refers to the karma that we have done in the past. Karma means volitions or actions. So karmic formation is basically our volition or actions from our bodies, speech, and mind. And this karma become a force that will lead us into our next life. So it lead us to the parent that we have affinities to it lead us to the family, like the background that we're in. And all these are based upon our past karma. So in another word, it's also from our own actions. Therefore, the suffering and joy in our life are determined by our own actions. They're not given to us by any superior beings. We reap what we sow. And I remember reading a story or sharing the story with you guys before or in previous classes. There is a king where one day he was talking to his daughter, like the princess. He said, you know what? You should be very thankful that you have a king as your father. And it's because I'm a king, you get to enjoy all these wealth and luxuries in life. But the princess looked at him and said, Father, you're wrong. You're not the cause of why I enjoy my luxuries and wealth. It's because of my own karma and merit. And when the king heard this, he became very angry. He said, how can you say such an ungrateful word? I give you everything. Fine, let me see how much merit you have. And because the king was so angry, he ordered his minister to find the poorest beggar in the city. And he really married off like his daughter, the princess, to this beggar and see what happened. But the princess was not sad or anything at all. She believed that there would be a way. She does believe that it's her own merit and karma that lead her to the wealth and luxuries. And so the first thing she asked her husband, she asked, my husband, how do you become a beggar? And her husband said, I used to be born in a wealthy family. However, a fire burned off all my house and my property and killed my parent and my families. As I was very young, so I became a beggar. The princess then said, after the fire burned the house down, there are land. So where is it? And the husband replied, what is the use with the land? There are only wastes on it. And the princess said, it's okay, let us go back to your to the land where your home used to be. Maybe we can go back and farm and grow some fruit and vegetables. So both of them went back to her husband's home or this land, and they start to dig and plow the land to grow stuff. As they were working with the land, they discovered the treasure hidden underneath the land. What happened is the beggar's parent actually hid all their treasure underground. So as a result, because now that the couples discovered these treasures, they became wealthy again and they start to build a house and then live a wealthy life. After the king heard of this, he thought, this is just what the Buddha taught us. Everyone must be responsible for his own wholesome and unwholesome deed, and everyone will also get to enjoy their own merit or suffer from their consequences as well. So, from the story, we can see that we create our own sufferings and happiness. Therefore, we should be very mindful of our actions. This is why Venerable Master Xing, our founder, taught us to practice the three acts of goodness, to do good deed, say good word, and think good thoughts, or practice the forgiving, give others people's confidence, give others joys, give others hope, and give others convenience. So if we can always do good, like say good thing and have good thoughts and always gives, then I'm sure we would always be surrounded by wholesome conditions. We'll always have very good relationship with other peoples. So in this case, how can we not lead a peaceful and happy life? So all the karmic formation that are created by our actions will be stored back in our consciousness. And so let us look at. So what happened is that following our karma, our consciousness will take us to the parent that we have affinities to. And then, of course, we'll enter the mother's womb. And one thing that we need to take notes is that there is no permanent thing that transmigrate from one life to another, because even consciousness arise from various causes and conditions, and it's also changing all the time. And consciousness also refer to the six consciousness that we have: the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, the nose consciousness, the tongue consciousness, the body consciousness, and our intellect consciousness, or our sixth consciousness. Okay, name and form. So name and form normally refer to, I would say, our body and mind. So our basically what happened is our consciousness would follow our karma from the past and enter the mother's womb. And then basically at this point, the form is the physical substance and the name is the mental part. Name refer to our mind, so it include feeling, perceptions, volitions, and consciousness. And forms, like, well, at the time we're probably a cell, but then it's also composed of the four great elements. So the four great elements are earth, water, fire, and wind. And the body and mind of the present life come to be due to the existence of rebirth linking consciousness. So our six senses are basically referring to the six sense organs that we have: the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And of course, when we're still in the mother's womb, our body is basically growing. So the baby developed the sixth sense organ. So when we're born, our sixth sense organ would come in contact with their associate object. Then the associate consciousness would arise. So for example, eyes would see sight, ear hear sound, nose smell fragrance, tongue taste flavor, body contact tactile touch, mind interact with the Dharma, or like the various mental qualities. So a contact is only created when the sixth sense organ interact with their associate objects and give rise to the sixth consciousness. So when all three of these arise are there, then this create a contact. So basically right now, all of you are looking at the video. So your eyes are come associating or come in contact with the sight, like this video right now. And when your eye see this video, the eye consciousness also arise. So all three of this create a contact. When there's a contact, feelings would definitely arise. So basically, the feelings arise based upon our sense impression. So there will be feelings born from our eye contact, feelings born from our ear contacts, from the nose contacts, from the tongue's contact, from the body's contacts, or even from like our intellect contact. And normally we categorize our feelings into three categories. There are unpleasant feelings, pleasant feelings, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant feelings. So what does last one, neither pleasant nor unpleasant feelings, refer to? For example, when you're walking down the street and you see a stranger, but you're not associated with the stranger, so you didn't really feel anything. So your feeling at the moment is not pleasant or it's not unpleasant. And so after feelings arise, craving would arise. If it's pleasant feelings, then we would give rise to desires, like we really want to have it. And if it's unpleasant feelings, then anger would arise. The Buddha said that there are craving of form, craving for sound, craving for smells, craving for taste, craving for tactile sensation, craving for ideas and thoughts. So in short, craving for the objects of our sixth sense organ. And this craving is a very strong force, just like the waterfall. Because when craving are there, it normally easily motivate us into actions. So this is what it said in the sutras. And where does this craving when arising arise? And where, when dwelling, does it dwell? Whatever is endearing and alluring in terms of the world, that is where it is craving when arising arise. That is where, when dwelling, it dwell. So what this mean is that whatever that is endearing and alluring to us, like whether it's what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch, what we smell, and maybe what we think, then if it's endearing for us, craving would arise. So whatever that we find pleasant, we would crave for, in summary. And always remember, craving is the root of our sufferings. Remember the Four Noble Truth, the causes of sufferings. Craving is the causes of our sufferings. But however, not all cravings are bad. The Buddha's great disciple, Venerable Alanda, said that this body comes into being through craving. Yet it is by relying on craving that craving is to be abandoned. So what Alanda was saying is that it's by craving to be liberated from sufferings. That's why we would become liberated. So we need to have this craving to be wanting to be liberated from suffering. So this motivate us into practice, and ultimately it lead to abandoning or be liberated from our sufferings. So when craving arise, it easily become clinging. So clinging, just like a name, it's just cling to us. So it's basically referring to the attachment that arise. And the four clinging that we have are sensualities clinging, view clinging, precept and practice clinging, and doctrine of self clinging. So this is referring, so for the sensualities clinging, it normally referred to our attachment to the five desires, such as wealth, sensual pleasures, fame, food, and sleep, and the five sense objects, such as sight, sound, fragrance, taste, and touch. And view clinging refer to the erroneous view that people cling to. And of course, there is self clinging, it's like the self attachment that we have. And last, the precept and practice clinging refer to the unreasonable precept that people uphold or that they are attached to. So all these attachment will lead us into actions to grasp at what we desire and take them to become our possession. So basically, craving lead to our actions into grasping whatever that we desires. And of course, when there's an actions, then there would be karma or becoming. Becoming, this word is a little bit more harder to understand, I guess. But becoming basically refer to existence. It also has the same meaning as karma. And of course, this karma is a force that will lead us to our futures. And the karma is created after we act to grasp at whatever that we desires. So again, karma refer to actions. So basically, karma is arise when we act, arise based on whatever we do, whatever we say, or whatever we think. So it contains sufficient momentum behind it at the time of death. So again, this is why it leads us to our next life. It's a force that would take us to our next life. And it is a force that might take us to be born in the realm of desires, realm of form, and the form or the formless and the formless realm. So all these realms are like the three planes of existence in the Buddhist cosmologies. When analyzing becoming as factors in dependent origination, the Buddha does not really define it, but instead he simply notes that it can occur on three levels. So which becoming? These three becomings, sensualities becoming, form becoming, and formless becoming. This is called becoming. So basically, these three are again referring to the three realms that I just talked about: realm of desires, form realm, and formless realm. And of course, this becoming or this karma take us to our next life, to this next birth, I guess, birth in our new life. And of course, when there's a birth, then we live our life again, and ultimately we will grow old and die. And then the cycle continue. So let us look at this 12 link in terms of a circle. So basically, you can see that it's referring, if you really look at it, we can look at it in terms of 3 lifespan. So due to our ignorance of not understanding the truth and because not of ignorance, not understanding the truth, we create a lot of karma, whether it's wholesome or unwholesome karma. And obviously, this karma from our past would take us, it's stored back in our consciousness, and this consciousness with the karma, like the karma would take us to our new life, and we entered the mother's womb, whoever is that we have affinities to. And then of course, then there is name and form, so we start to develop this body and mind, right? And of course, we'll start to develop our sixth sense organ. So when we're born, we start to interact with the world, and obviously there will be contact because our sixth sense organ obviously are busy interacting with the outside world, and our mind thinking about it. And when there's contact, feelings would arise depending on whether it's pleasant or unpleasant feelings, then either way, craving, it will lead to craving. So if it's pleasant feelings, then we'll have desires for it, like strong desires. When it's unpleasant feelings, then anger or aversion would arise. But then either way, this craving will lead to clinging. It becomes this attachment that we have. And obviously this attachment lead us to actions because we want to grasp or hold on to it. And whenever there's actions, there's karma again. And so throughout our life, we would encounter every single moment, I would say. It's always like contact, feelings, craving, and clinging, and then becoming. So we accumulate all these different karma. And then when this life ends, then this all our karma will lead us to our next life, to the future life, like the third, oh, yeah, the next life, I should say. That's better. Our next life. And then so we're born again, and then we go through our life, and then aging and death. And again, the cycle continue. And so basically, that's a summary of how we travel from one life to another, how we transmigrate within this cycle of life and death. And of course, the cycle, as the Buddha said, it will lead to the mass of sufferings that we have. If we examine the 12 conditions, we will understand that our life go on, just like the burning of a wood. Like we put one wood after another, but then the fire remain the same. So it's sort of like our life. Like although our body is different every single time, but then who we are inside remain the same. But this is not to say that there is the self, because there is no non-self, like we don't really have the self. But that would be like a class for another day, lesson for another time. And from this cycle, we can also understand that we too arise based on causes and conditions. It is because of our ignorance of the truth we start on this journey. We start to transmigrate life after life and create a lot of sufferings for ourselves. It might seem like we're forever trapped in the cycle. However, remember the sutras that we read together. Then the thought occurred to me, aging and death don't exist when what doesn't exist. From the cessation of what comes the cessation of aging and death. From my appropriate attention, there came the breakthrough of discernment. Aging and death doesn't exist when birth doesn't exist. From the cessation of birth comes the cessation of aging and death. And then remember this reverse contemplation, right? So what the Buddha told us is that there is a way to end the cycle. And so if one conditions in the cycle cease to be, then the next conditions would cease to be as well. Just like domino, everything would then break down. So there would be a way that we can break through from the cycle. And of course, like the sutras, if you remember at the beginning of the class, practice the Noble Eightfold Path, right? But then next week, we will talk more about how to break the cycle, because our goal is definitely to be liberated from our sufferings. And so I hope that for this week, after listening to the class, you can take some time and become more familiar with the 12 link of dependent originations, like what are the 12 conditions and their relationship. And then next week, we'll talk more about how we can break through from the cycle. So thank you for listening to this class. I'll see you next week. Take care and stay safe. 弥陀佛。